Greetings everyone. My name is Hannah Hölling and I am research professor here at Bern University of the Arts and the project lead on two initiatives, which is performance, conservation materiality knowledge, and activating Fluxus, within which context we are meeting today. I am really delighted to welcome everyone to our Research Wednesday seminar series. We have a distinguished guest today, Hannah Higgins, joining us from the University of Illinois at Chicago. A very warm welcome, Hannah, and welcome to our audiences joining us globally today. I extend also my greetings on behalf of my colleagues, the co-members of our project, who are here, Josephine Ellis and Aga Wielocha, joining us from her research leave. Markus Gossold, Johannes Hedinger of the artistic duo Com, as well as our associated members, Elke Grün, Sally Kawamura, Emily Parendo, and Stephanie Mantei. It is really a huge pleasure to see many of them here with us today. Our research team has come together thanks to the generous support of the Swiss National Science Foundation at the research division of the Bern University of the Arts. We would like to thank our department, especially Thomas Gardman, who's heading the research division, and Sebastian Dobruskin, head of the Institute Materiality of Arts and Culture, for all their support of our project, and also together with Carmen Effner of this event. Our research project, Activating Fluxus, takes on the concept of activation to engage with the Fluxus material conceptual legacy, examining the lives and afterlives of Fluxus objects, events, and ephemera created in the 1960s, 70s, and sometimes thereafter. In short, our project considers the fundamentally transitory aspect of Fluxus forms, events, event scores, and transitional objects not destined for preservation. It focuses on the possibility of activation of Fluxus, a concept challenged by a paradoxical coexistence of ephemerality and materiality in Fluxus, and its presence between collections and archives. It also seeks new ways to engage with its rich legacy through a multidisciplinary lens of conservation, art history, performance studies, and museology. Professor Hannah Higgins, whose scholarship on Fluxus has been foundational, really, for many scholars working on this theme, will be now introduced by my colleague, Josephine. So I'm just giving the screen over to Josie now.
Thank you, Hannah. My name is Josephine. I'm the PhD student in the project, and today I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Professor Hannah Higgins, who is solo author of Fluxus Experience, published in 2002 by the University of California Press, recently translated into Korean, and a Spanish translation is also forthcoming. She is also author of The Grid Book, published in 2009 by MIT Press, and co-editor with Douglas Kahn of Mainframe, Experimentalism, Early Computing, and the Foundations of Digital Art, published in 2012 by the University of California Press, with a forthcoming translation in Chinese. She has received the UIC University Scholar Award and DAAD, Getty Research Institute, Phillips Collection, and Emily Harvey Foundation Fellowships. Higgins is daughter of Fluxus artists Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles, and is co-executor of the Estate of Dick Higgins and the Something Else Press. Her research examines 20th century avant-garde art with a specific interest in Dadaism, Surrealism, Fluxus, happenings, performance art, food art, and early computer art. Her books and articles argue for the humanistic value of multimodal sensory cognitive experience. In today's presentation, titled Now That You're Ready for the Real Thing, Professor Higgins examines the place of the real across some paradigmatic Fluxus events, kits, and actions. This talk theorizes a Fluxus multisensory aesthetics and ethics beyond the art world, while framing a few of the substantial challenges that George Maciunas' term non-art reality brings to Fluxus exhibition and preservation. Before I finally pass the screen to Professor Higgins, just a few words of housekeeping. The lecture, which will take approximately 45 minutes, will be followed by a discussion and a public Q&A session. The audience is welcome to post questions in the chat, which we will monitor closely. Finally, please note that the event is being recorded and will be made available online. Over to you, Professor Higgins.
Oh my, thank you so much, Josephine, and thank you for moderating. I really appreciate it, and I especially love this project. I have been following Hannah's work now for many years, and am just so humbled by what this project is doing, and I'm delighted really to be invited to participate. I have produced something that I hope you'll find interesting, but which is a bit of a departure from what I did in Fluxus Experience, since it's enough widely read that I sort of am tired of making precisely that argument. So what I'm presenting today is admittedly a little provisional, and I am hoping with Hannah's permission to work this up for her forthcoming anthology. So thank you all very, very much for the kind invitation. It is much appreciated. Okay, there we go. We're looking at the front page of the February 1964 issue of the VTRE Fluxus newsletter. At the upper left, Fluxus appears in white letters in a black box. At the right, Fluxus appears in black letters that form a sort of block. Beginning even here, it's clear that Fluxus is both a conceptual and material, positive and negative space, mediated and mediating. VTRE anchors the masthead. This is the second issue of the publication, edited by the Fluxus artist George Brecht and the Fluxus editorial committee, meaning George Maciunas, the Fluxus artist designer and impresario, and over time, a changing cadre of Fluxus artists. The council idea makes Fluxus a group with leaders of some kind. That group appears organized around, well, we'll get to that later. For the moment, let's focus on the lead stories and especially how a reader might see them. Hang on. The latest news is in the lead position, the upper left corner. These are not the million random digits published by the RAND Corporation, which appear in cubes, but they may as well be. The numbers are moving up, but I can't tell by what mechanism. This lead story is, for want of a better term, unreadable, but it is not unseeable. That seems to be its point. It is either obtuse, unknowable, or boring, and maybe all of the above. Moving further down along the left side, the latest boring, obtuse, unknowable news is followed by Moanin' High, which details the pain of tummy flattening girdles. That's the belly shrinking underwear that women wear under dresses at altitude, where bellies tend to bloat. Below that, some existential questions are posed, perhaps by Maciunas. They concern boredom, work, and anger. Do you ever find yourself, quote, not staying alert to what you're doing? 2, failing to use the right equipment for a job? 3, throwing things, end quote. This section doesn't appear to be clipped from another source. It is written in the voice of the paper. It clues us into the crosshairs of nature's society and human experience. Having just tried to understand the numbers, to read them in the latest news, or the ill-conceived tool of a girdle for flight, who could blame the reader for a touch of rage? These are motivational questions. A yes to any of them is an existential challenge, or could be. Below this editorial comment, a story about thieves getting locked in a women's bathroom because they cut through the ceiling and ended up in a locked women's room. Wrong equipment, I guess. At the lower left, financials Flux Bucks, How I Came into Money, which Maciunas did not, and a cheeky solution, Send Those Dollars to Fluxus. A half column appears next to the latest news. At the top, a picture followed by a description of a bean dealer, Adolf Koshland from San Francisco, taken from Alison Knowles's Bean Research for the Bean Rolls. Below the story of the successful merchant, a collection of knots, followed by an article, 700 mosquito men to gang up on pest. We imagine men in mosquito suits ganging up on the hapless capitalist. Maybe he's a has-been. But instead, what follows is an article that describes a justice, Tom C. Clark of the US Supreme Court, coming out against the death penalty. It seems the judicial system are the mosquitoes ganging up on what? The death penalty? Or is the target the bean man up above? Or both, or neither? At the bottom of this half column is an article about British youth arrested for pushing a piano over a cliff, Fluxus style. But papers aren't usually read this way along the columns. We might as easily read across the top. From the blizzard of numbers to the bean counter, bean merchant, the opacity of economies. The girdled girls who suffer in altitude might be read across the threshold of binding knots. What are girdles if not binding knots for women? To the second major lead article, maybe there's something liberating going on left to right above the fold. The reader would slam head on, so to speak, into the lead article, fashions with the custom comfort for executives, diplomats, businessmen, and lawyers. Clearly not the same clothing as the hapless women wear in the stewardess article. This image depicts something far more comfortable than the binding girdle. This 1896 patent advertises comfort that is both physical and social, a marker of elevated status, a saluting device. The reader is directed by a Victorian pointed finger that appears in printed form in many George Brecht events and associated with the work of his friends in CCV3. Here, the reader finds an official cadre, maybe a building committee, a city commission, or some such, flipping the switch on a building project. Their hats are construction hats, presumably without the saluting device, but otherwise shaped similarly, albeit in hard plastic instead of felt. They protect the wearer. They also speak of class mixing or class posing of the staged kind. These men in suits don't normally wear such hats. This is a photo op. An American flag hangs to the left of the leftmost man. Instead of a description of who is in the picture, the words, quote, "Will you be one of the privileged Americans to share this unique experience?" End quote. Probably not. Too busy, not staying alert, failing to use the right equipment, and throwing things. A man gets a special haircut with enormous scissors below this, and at the bottom of this column ends with a warning: be suspicious. Indeed. Newspaper articles on paper were conceived as columns that might begin that way, as vertical columns, and maybe be read across and among the articles. This slide is kind of a joke, but it's a joke I mean in earnest. The man in the self-saluting hat clearly takes center stage. He'd be the first to be read and seen. The image is the largest. The lead story presents us with a machine. From here, my eye is drawn to the largest rectangular blocks, the dollar bill, men in hard hats, and at the lower right, the word wow. Across this surface, like paper newspapers in general, the reader scans and chooses what to read, making their own connections. Design emphasis notwithstanding, The reader experience is also a seeing experience that produces imagined and real connections and tensions as we see and read the newspaper. Glancing from topic to topic by font size, image, attention-grabbing headline, matters of reading habit, left to right and top to bottom, are both emphasized and toyed with. It has often been said that Maciunas was an all-over designer who squeezed every inch of content into whatever scraps of paper were at his disposal from his paying design jobs. That attitude is certainly in place in this dizzying array, which is nevertheless formed of clever, small-scale associations by topic and by political critique. As if to make this last point clear, the worldwide general strike for peace appears dead center at the bottom. A few clicks below a traffic light and an absurd comment, perhaps a Fluxus performance by an attorney general. The point is that how the page is read and seen models something essential about Maciunas's vision for Fluxus. The point is that from a design standpoint, the quietest part of this front page is tucked along the right side. It would likely be seen or read rather late in the game. At least this is how the page works visually. When Maciunas writes, "Now that you're ready for the real thing," this is what I take him to mean. By virtue of his design emphasis, the reader has been prepared for what's coming next. The far right side of this CCV tree is all Fluxus. In a clean column in the IBM Universe typeface from Maciunas's now legendary Executive 065 Composer typewriter, Maciunas lists Fluxus publications for sale that can be viewed and purchased at George Wittenborn, 1018 Madison Avenue. Wittenborn was a dealer in art books, a refugee of World War II who had a gallery up among the advertising companies where Maciunas made his living as a graphic designer. A consummate designer, Maciunas understood the relationship between seeing and reading and designed accordingly. The method of open design for seeing and reading encourages the reader to return to a point in order to make new points of comparison, new frameworks for thinking and knowing, and to have fresh insights into the myriad of economic, political, and social interjacencies that make up a world, or in this case, the world of Fluxus as he understood it. The real thing he has in mind is clearly must be Fluxus, since what follows is a list of Fluxus materials for sale and a mention of the March to May Fluxus Festival of 1964. Particularly when we account for the relationship between linear reading and scanning all over, as typical of the CCV Tree newsletter, it is clear that being ready for the real thing speaks to what comes next. The first page depicts a world rife with class, gender, and professional hierarchies that are carefully constructed using clothing, the production of architecture, the creation of laws that seamlessly span from silly burglars locked in a ladies' toilet and arresting youth for throwing a piano over a cliff, but at the other extreme, capital punishment. Which unique experience does the headline, "Will you be one of the privileged Americans to share this unique experience," actually refer to? Joining the cadre of architects and planners, capital punishment, wearing the girdle, or the gentleman's hat? Before turning the page to whatever the real thing is, now that we're ready for it, I hope you'll tolerate a detour. Astrid Schmidt-Burkhardt's brilliant 2004 examination of the diagrams of the Gilbert and Lila Silverman Fluxus collection is titled Maciunas' Learning Machines, From Art History to a Chronology of Fluxus. The book details 36 physical charts designed by Maciunas from 1953 to 1973. These charts form folded, layered, spatial, and temporal histories of ideas, ancient and modern art history, revolutions, and artistic interactions. As Burkhardt notes, these diagrams depict, quote, a network of tightly interwoven political, cultural, historical, economic, poetic, aesthetic elements, which then itself calls for universal significance, end quote. Some of them, as shown here, actually unfold in space as well as time. They are three-dimensional and maybe four in the reading. Given my description of reading the CC-VTRE opening page, these Fluxus newsletters are clearly also learning machines. It should be noted that newspapers are, in any case, designed to be folded. When the page is flipped, this networked aspect of the publication takes center page. I will try to describe this way of reading the paper. Underneath a picture of Joe Jones wearing a motorized radio hat built on a construction hat, a caption appears. It reads, Science Projects, Joe Jones. In case the reader didn't get the point, a headline appears as a subtext, Unique New Teaching Machine, end quote. This is a site for learning. Exactly what isn't clear, though we've been prepared, on page 1, and it must have something to do with this image. Direct connectivity to page 1 occurs by association with the hats and at the level of hat design. It is as if the motor had broken through to the outside of the gentleman's hat on page 1. It has combined forces with the construction hats below, forming a consolidated symbol. This unique new teaching machine, Joe Jones's hat, slips and slides across the thresholds of art and non-art. It is also placed almost exactly on the obverse, reverse side of the same sheet of paper as the self-saluting hat. Moving from page 1, where non-art elements take up the left 2/3 of the page and Fluxus the right 1/3, Fluxus event performances dominate on page 2. The kits have been largely jettisoned for performance. A very different kind of real Fluxus thing, but no less strange. Now that you're ready for the real thing is a preamble for all that is possible, taken as a pedagogical and political tool, a way to view Fluxus. Being ready for the real thing of Fluxus kits, performances, and some different way of being in the world sets the stage for Maciunas' pedagogical and political commitments, as much as the phrase is also a play on everyday sentiments. Get real, be real. That's the real deal. For real, real life. Most importantly for us here today, Maciunas' much discussed, debated, adored, and reviled Purge Manifesto of 1963 committed Fluxus, against the wishes of some of the artists, to non-art reality and to being a united front and action of political revolution. If we view being ready for the real thing through his mission to promote living art, anti-art, promote non-art reality to be fully grasped, scratch that, just grasped by all peoples, not only critics, dilettantes, and professionals, how the CC-VTRE papers are seen and read renders the unique teaching machine on Joe Jones's head as both a regular machine on a hat, like what we saw on page 1, but also a teaching device committed to non-art reality. The manifesto includes elements of flux from science, with the textual logic appearing on page 2 of the CC-VTRE as a descriptor, not just of Joe Jones's hat, but the page. It matters that non-art reality appears in the manifesto without punctuation. It could mean non-art reality, meaning Fluxus is distinct from the many avant-garde efforts to blend the art-life divide, but it can also mean non-art reality, meaning those forms of reality that have nothing to do with art of any kind. The real in both possibilities represents a horizon, a framework offered to Fluxus artists and friends who take up the challenge to explore how the threshold operates between non-art reality and non-art reality. To be sure, nothing irritated the teacher of this Fluxus master class, George Maciunas, more than a tilt too far into the forbidden territory of critics, dilettantes, and professionals policing the border. The point is that both art and reality are dialectical to their core. Human experience occurs at the threshold of what is sensorially shared, of what is a sensorially shared basis for how we engage with each other. Everything else is interpretation. But interpretation is also everything, since culture happens there. The threshold has reached an impasse. It is usefully tautological. Within the visual logic of modernist abstract painting, a critical and display apparatus of critics and galleries was necessary as a bulwark against the art idea that art couldn't be abstract. This is what Maciunas is challenging when he attacks abstract art and dilettantes. Relatedly, Fluxus was a community of a chemist, a designer, several musicians, and even artists. The question of what is and was real and what is and was art opened up the horizon of possibility described by Schmidt-Burckhardt as learning machines, or as seen here, a teaching machine. Reading and seeing the CC-VTREs provides a key, a mechanism for accessing non-art reality in all senses of the phrase. This machine, the paper, activates the objective and subjective components of the real as something requiring preparation to experience. On the lower half of page 2, a man paints a stripe down a road. Below him, the caption is the text of an event by Lamont Young, Draw a Straight Line and Follow It, which was most famously performed by Namjoon Paik in Wiesbaden in 1962 using his head. It is possible to get something from the sequence, even without any knowledge of Fluxus as art. Across the spread, Takehisa Kosugi's theater music, Keep Walking Intently, results in a circle of feet. Oh, 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 just to the right, those tired feet. Need relief? They need quick relief to the left of Kosugi's feet. 2 feet that say kick, coup de pied, as a form of creation. We have entered the realm of walking as an art form. It appears across these 2 pages. For the attuned to everyday life, walking may stand alone as a form of exercise or daily activity, or become a meditation. Through the lens of art, walking rises to the level of situationist derive or Baudelarian wandering, which tradition Laurie Waxman has explored with real insight in her book, Keep Walking Intently, The Ambulatory Art of the Surrealists, The Situationist International, and Fluxus. The rhythm of the artist's walk, of the step, brings up the matter of time, of music, the stone stuck in my sneaker, a puddle, the stubborn Lorax of Dr. Seuss's children's story, which ends at a highway underpass. Since artist walks involve getting away from the planned public space, this last connection makes sense. On further reflection, those feet look an awful lot like gears. How free are we really to walk as we wish? How do mechanical time and the human gait resonate with each other or not? And what happens when the rotating circle of feet and the straight line interact? When this open spread is closed, do those gears of feet pick up on the shape of the mechanical hat on Joe Jones's head and the hat on page 1? Do we think mechanistically? Perhaps not. But clearly I've made a mistake in my reading. Most readers receiving the CCV would have been in on some part of the material and its history. I've made a mistake by assuming the reader didn't know what they were ready for or being prepared for. Most readers would have known exactly what they were reading or seeing. As already noted on the lower half of page 2, on the left here, a man paints a stripe down a road. Below him, the caption is an event by Lamont Young. Draw a straight line and follow it. The image of a man painting a stripe down a road means he is both drawing the straight line and following it. This is an image taken out of context as one possible way to perform Lamont Young's instruction. This man wouldn't have known, of course, that he was performing the piece. He is from an earlier time, maybe another disposition, is from another time and place, maybe another disposition from artists. But someone with knowledge of Lamont Young's score would immediately see the action in hindsight that way. The past and elsewhere in the world are clearly shaped by what we know, by what we've learned. This pleasure of recognition extrapolates meaning from the world. This is one of the great pleasures of engaging with Fluxus scholarship, especially with others who know it well. To be sure, the person may also be performing the score next to the spiral of feet, Takahisa Kosugi's theater piece with the instruction, keep walking intently, which this figure certainly is. Since the image of the man rolling the paving painter is closer to the Lamont Young and the Kosugi is closer to the feet spiral, I'll go on the assumption the images are being used to illustrate some way about the two different walking scores, but they also usefully illustrate their slippage. It matters that the same caption can be attached to different images seen. And just as kind of an aside, this is one of the real pleasures of coming across photographs of Fluxus events, sort of imagining which events they might be. With Robert Dunn, Young performed the same instruction 30 times in succession over 2 evenings with the aid of a plumb bob and yardstick at his and Yoko Ono's benchmark Chambers Street Loft series in 1960 to 61. According to Natalie Herron's important analysis of Fluxus scores in her book, Fluxus Forms, the piece lasted over 3 hours as the line was carefully drawn, then followed, etc., 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 drawn, then followed. You get the point. Robert Morris, to whom the piece is dedicated, was married to the dancer Simone Forti. At some level, this reflects his encounter with dance. In any case, the event at the Chamber Street series would have looked nothing like what Maciunas imagines in his publication 4 years later. But there is an important distinction to be made. They are not the same piece, despite being the same instruction. The instruction means one thing when it is dedicated to Bob Morris in 1960, and something else in 1961, when it is published with a series of dates. Lamont Young's book, Compositions, 1961, consists entirely of this instruction, but with different dates. It was published by George Maciunas' Fluxus imprint and appears on page 1 as one of the things to see at George Wittenborn's shop. As a sequence of actions taken over the course of different days, the reader or performer might take note of the fact that the same instruction on different days would be quite, to state the obvious, different. Or more precisely, in some ways, the same, but in other ways, very different. Where, when, how long, what season, with what tools. The distinction between how we might read the same instruction or the same words framed a little different, but as factually true, lies at the core of Maciunas's elastic, context-driven dialectical pedagogy. Much of the joy in reading and seeing CC-VTRE lies in this collaging effect from the real world. But the moving about and changing nature of this score across the single document produces the effect of changing contexts from within Fluxus itself. For the sake of argument, let's take the score in the CC-VTRE as a speech act situated next to the thing it describes. The score describes the action of the man painting a straight line and following it. It is, as used here, a constative speech act, meaning it is a statement that can be true or false. In this case, it is true. If I used Young's text, draw a straight line and follow it, to describe the spiral feet, the statement would be false. Even though, for example, Kosugi's continue walking intently might fit the image designated for Young. The fact that the same text can describe two different pictures in Fluxus works or of Fluxus works has led to much useful confusion. This is because there is a gap between a constative statement and a performative statement, which, which is an instruction as I'm using it here. What the performative text, draw a straight line and follow it, means hinges on many things. To whom is the instruction directed? Where, when, etc. Performative speech acts result in different outcomes, as when Young and Dunn executed the instruction versus how it was depicted in CC-VTRE. Maciunas is clearly playing with these gaps between constative statements, facts or lies, and performative ones. Actually, this happens all over the publication. Maciunas's commitment to Marxist dialectics is useful here. I quote from Das Kapital. Dialectics includes in its comprehension an affirmative recognition of the existing state of things. At the same time, also, the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature, not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. But there's more. There are three types of force typically cited in basic speech act theory as associated with J.L. Austin. These are locutionary force, illocutionary force, and paralocutionary force. Locutionary force means the referential value, the meaning of code. In this case, Lamont Young, as a composer interested in single notes, impacts how we see or maybe even hear this instruction. Early performances of number 9 included playing an audible hum, Richard Maxfield's tape recording of a single note bowing a brass mortar. This recording was used by Warhol as the soundtrack to Eat, Sleep, Haircut, and Kiss, according to Jeremy Grimshaw. Okay. The same text as number 9 in 1960 has no addressee. It isn't to anyone and can be represented as a symbol line on a card, shown here at the far right. A musician might play the line as a pitch, for which Young is best known, and which is clear in the association with Richard Maxfield. Directing the same performative to Morris, however, changes what it means. In this case, introducing the tonal line to space by way of a sculptor married to the dancer Simone Morris, now known as Simone Forti. Placed in the CCV but without the reference to Morris, or as part of the 1960 series, the same instruction shifts meaning again by joining the code context of Fluxus. Illocutionary force reinforces the intermedial character of this directive. The instruction is by Lamont Young. This is a performative function by virtue of the implication of a speaker, what someone might imagine the instruction to mean coming from him, which takes us to paralocutionary force, the inference by a particular addressee. When Namjoon Paik performed this piece famously and in Heron's wonderful analysis errantly in 1962, paralocutionary force, the powerful inference of this addressee, also a musician and student of Stockhausen, was sufficiently powerful that the piece actually changed. Using his tie, his head, and eventually his feet to perform the piece, Namjoon Paik shifted the sequential nature of the word "and" to draw and then follow to an additive. He introduced the idea of doing them at precisely the same time. The constitutive status of the text is unchanged. It is still true to describe the action this way. The performative action remains intact, but the playful adaptation of the instruction foregrounds paralocution. As inferred by this addressee, the piece became a standard event at Fluxus concerts ever since, and is now, as very many scholars have rightly noted, known simply as Zen for head. The Paik version is part of the Flux canon. When Maciunas placed his street painter above the score in 1964, he would have had pictures of Paik's 1962 performance in his possession, but he chose this image instead. This is Young's version, if we can call it that. Maciunas, too, is responding to Young's instruction in terms that foreground paralocution, that seek new ways of interpreting the instruction as understood by Paik. The result offers evidence of the truly vast potential of the event as a performance structure. Maciunas's version of the score, his paralocution, is like opaques. The and produces simultaneity. But he introduces another aspect, one appropriate to Maciunas's interest in mechanical devices and labor. Particularly as time passes, this is where I see the power of the event as a performance structure. The mind should be activated, inventive in the face of, seeking ways to rethink the event text in terms that are simultaneously constitutive, true to what's written down, performative as instructions, while working with types of force that build bridges between the locutionary, illocutionary, and paralocutionary force of the actors. For me, bowler hats and restaged photographs are not interesting. Events should not be reperformed. Having been made ready and using the newspaper as a teaching machine that contains this one event text in 2, 3, maybe 4 different forms. You can see the line of notes at the bottom. I turn the page one more time. The dominant text here reads, Wood, in parentheses, world famous founder of reading dynamics, will show you how to read and in tiny type comprehend 3 to 10. That's it. It doesn't say 3 to 10 what. Shall we comprehend numbers? Or maybe comprehend being writ small. The point is that the Evelyn Wood reading system is so stupid, it prioritizes speed over knowing anything. On further reflection, numbers are interesting, particularly on this page. What are we to make of the photo of Dieter Roth by Christer Christian with a hole in it that's just to the right of the text? The image dominates the page. Roth's poem machines consisted of pages with holes that could be turned to the world or a page to collect poetic content. Can the head, the mind, be both an empty vessel and a bracketing or framing device for a world conceived as poetic? Maciunas is clearly making fun of the ever-accelerated modern model of education where the mind is treated like an empty vessel to be filled with whatever garbage the mind comes across. Using the Wood method, it would be literally stuffed. But the news isn't all bad on this last page of the newsletter. An observant reader might notice the score up top for George Brecht's direction, travel in the indicated direction, or travel in another direction. Direction is followed by a double row of pointing fingers, all going in one direction, except for the one that seems to say, go back. In Maciunas's terms, it might mean go rear guard, stop advancing. Traveling in a different direction is also allowed as part of the piece's performative statement. Maciunas's use of the fingers makes this illustration true. All humor aside, the retro stylization and directionality of these hands reminds us that progress is an illusion, or if not an absolute illusion, a convenient temporal framework for a society hegemonically conceived. Things don't actually work this way, though we may make progress here and there. By asking the user to either travel in the indicated direction or travel in another direction, the score builds deliberation and a variety of outcomes into itself for a given reader. The point is the deliberation. Thoughtful deliberation versus blind following is the point's point. Brecht was not an explicitly political artist, not at all. Nevertheless, this event hovers at the intersection of revolution and evolution or movement and stasis. Of course, this too could be an illustration to draw a straight line and follow it, but it includes the direction to not. In case the reader missed the point, Jackson McClow's 100 is literally 100 ones written out in letters. Reading this by speed reading entirely misses the point. It should be read slow. Another Victorian hand points, this time up, and offers an instruction. Pick the fun number. They are at first glance all the same, all ones. On second glance, however, and read slowly, perhaps the one at the edge is more fun, means something different from a one in the middle. Or maybe oneness is the point. Can I have it both ways? Can I choose one direction and then another? Taking this issue of CCV-tree as a whole, we might ask how the teaching machine interacts with the poem machine. This last image of a head sits on that same part of the printed page as the gear feet spiral, the Joe Jones radio hat, and the saluting device on page 1. The dotted line, a common instructional representation of cutting, invites this three-dimensional read, the reading Schmidt-Burkhardt discovered in her analysis of the charts. If this CCV tree were sitting on a table, a reader might notice topical, ludic, and formal connections between the first, second, third, and last page. There's more. There are O's throughout that resonate with McClow's ones, which each contain a letter O, which is also a 0. At their best, the sensory cognitive range of Fluxus events and Flux kits opens the world up to a dialectical encounter rendered explicit in this newspaper. The word versus the real, my real versus your real, the individual and the social, reality versus art, non-art versus art reality, the rhythm of my footsteps versus your machine, my machine versus your footstep, a straight line versus following versus not following, the unique experience versus the shared experience. These insights are a product of actively reading this CCV tree as a teaching and learning machine. There is no one path, just as there is no one Fluxus. As a dialectic, oppositions are resolved in that knottiest of human projects, experience, which is by definition made of a rhythmic totality that is inherently aesthetic, as I argued in Fluxus Experience. The source visual context for this talk is a CCV tree publication that appeared in facsimile form recently published by Primary Information in New York. This facsimile is part of a time-honored tradition internal to Fluxus. Maciunas made kits throughout his lifetime, which is why they may differ from one to the next. The challenge of keeping Fluxus material alive and inexpensive was taken up by Barbara Moore in the 1980s. She made editions using Maciunas's leftover materials. He desired to keep his publications, all of them in print indefinitely, a request which she honored. These reflux editions and the facsimiles published by Primary Information and other presses prepare the reader for encounters with the real thing in a dialectical sense that is simultaneously formal, material, political, historical, and in the present. Of course, no facsimile is perfect, and especially for Fluxus, that is A-okay. In their era, each CCV tree would have been received every month or so, then every year, then by decade. It would have been almost impossible for an everyday user to have all the CCV trees in one place, even after 1979, maybe especially after 1979. The readers would have taken a very long duration indeed to encounter them all. But in this volume, all of the newspapers are bound together in a single place. They can be read through, even though it would have been unlikely or impossible for most people to find them all. That is why I chose to focus on only one. This means that while the papers here take the readable form of the CCV tree, their history, the history of reading them as they appeared in their time, is compressed, their time rendered almost instantaneous. They become artifacts of a bracketed timeline that might have felt open-ended until one was designated as the last, the Maciunas memorial issue. These are also smaller. They are easier to handle. Flipping through them, patterns of production, a gradual sliding into a documentary mode that is about Maciunas from 1964 to 1979, his life, his wedding to Billy Hutchins, his death, his afterlife. Fluxus shifts mode over time. Ceremonial sites of passage move to the foreground. I only had time in this talk to engage with one of the CCV trees, which means there's so much more to learn from these remarkable learning machines. I hope I've modeled some ways into this activation. Thank you very much. I have no idea how long I've been on, but thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really absolutely inspiring and thought-provoking. We have, I think Josie wanted to actually start the Q&A, so I'm gonna wait whether she's gonna pick it up. Josie, I'm seeing you now. That's great. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, we can now start the discussion and Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to turn on your microphone and video to ask Hannah directly, or you can also type it into the chat. And yeah, I can also take the liberty of kickstarting this discussion. Hannah, I think you were kind of starting to hint towards it in your last slide, but I wanted to come also back more to the design of the newspaper and how the design might make our bodies move in a certain way. And you mentioned specifically at one point that newspapers are designed to be folded. So by extension, they are perhaps also designed to be unfolded too. So my question was whether this act of folding and unfolding impacts or affects the reading or seeing, which are maybe two different kind of embodied experiences as well of the CCV trees. So yeah, whether I'm just curious as to whether the folding and unfolding of the newspapers are at all part of the CCV trees as this kind of learning, teaching machine.
Oh, I think so. And I'm so glad you asked that. And I want to say what a pleasure it is to see so many friends here. I had no idea who was here. So hello, friends. And I see some folks here who were quoted or referenced anyway. So absolutely. I think, Maciunas is entirely conscious of the ways that the body interacts with the boxes and with the papers. And there are events like Alison's newspaper music, where the kind of interaction with the everyday newspaper is certainly part of the structure of it, the sound of the turning. I could have, there was another sort of parallel universe way of doing this that would have looked really closely at the listing of specific events, for example, on that second page, and how the sort of, you know, what that particular clustering evokes. So absolutely, I think that's such a good, I don't know, I think I turned off screen sharing, but my computer's doing something weird. So I might have just blasted you all with a picture of page 2, sorry. But yeah, I absolutely think so. And one of the things I found myself really thinking about was the edges. There's, I didn't really have time to go into it, but there's a concentration of material around the edges of the newspapers, and I think that produces a kind of tension, a seeing tension, versus the kind of left to right, top to bottom, even in those smaller column formats that I think Maciunas is playing with, because it's very hard in some of the longer texts, especially in other CCV trees, to hold to the content of the reading, because there'll be a large form or shape nearby that's kind of demanding attention. So yeah, so I think the relationship between seeing and reading is absolutely critical to how the full size V trees work, for sure. Thank you. That's a really good question. But one issue that has come up for me in thinking critically about my own prior work, especially the way that Fluxus Experience is argued, is I don't really account for kind of points of cultural difference. And that, I think, is something that, I mean, I couldn't have really understood it at the time as an issue. My mind wasn't there yet. And I'm sort of interested to see what happens with Fluxus Experience being out in Korean, because, for example, you know, walking means something very different in Japan versus in New York in 1962 or 64. And that kind of situated reading of the body is important work that, you know, should be being addressed, or could be being addressed by future generations of Fluxus scholars. So, you know, I'm really happy to see that changing. Happy to see that shift. So, like when I talk about, for example, Kasugi, you know, keep walking intently in the context of Lamont Young. There is something weird about that comparison. I mean, it's super interesting because of Young's interest in Buddhism, and kind of what it means for that interest to kind of get to the United States versus what it might mean for Kasugi, right? So, you know, all of that is material that I haven't really theorized anywhere at all, but which represents, I think, really a nearly endless bounty of critical reading, both of Fluxus, but also, you know, my own work. So I'm excited by those problems, by those gaps. I hope I made that clear. Yeah.
There are a few questions here. Shall we, Josie, yes, shall we take a few questions from the audience? An individual named Adham, perhaps it's not his name. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Curious how you imagine Maciunas would think of such an analysis of the design of the paper, or rather, if you could reflect on whether you think he was himself analytical in his approach, or more free-flowing in the creation of the paper. And there are a few more questions, so we'll have lots to ask.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think Maciunas was extremely intentional, including intentional in his use of chance, meaning I think there are elements that are given over to a kind of structuring by the world. But when I look especially at that first page between like the girdles and the knots and the, you know, I mean, the discussion of the kind of bean counter, the bean merchant with the random numbers, those seem to me tight enough. That's what I meant when I said local associations, that I think he is very, very structured in elements of the paper. And then I think he's looking for places to put things once kind of that structure is in place. But I am not an expert in Maciunas as a designer. There may be someone here who actually knows a little bit more about kind of how his designs evolved of the newspapers. That's not actually something I know. I was working with, the output. Oh yeah, interesting.
Mhm.
Who's that? Oh, Natalie Heron. Thank you,
Yes,
Natalie.
we have two. Yes, we have two
I
questions
have
there.
here a comment from Natalie, a small note that you could also possibly connect the line drawing machine image back to the bowler hat machine image as a bodily comfort technology. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's really hard on the body to draw a straight line and follow it in the line drawing machine is the one tool designed precisely to do that. Yes, that's a really excellent point. Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Really good.
Excellent. Shall we come back to Adam actually add something, and it might have a logical follow-up here.
Okay.
And another question, if I may, he says, are you aware if there is any link between Maciunas or the other Fluxus members and Greg Hill, aka Malak Clips the Younger, and Carrie Tomley, and apologies if I'm pronouncing it wrongly, or Lord Omar Khayyam Rayhurst? Are you aware of those, Hannah?
I am not, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Maciunas's network was vast, and these materials are finding their way all over the world. I've had folks contact me saying they were receiving mail from Maciunas in places that today maybe aren't so far away, but at the time seemed very far away indeed, and where I wasn't particularly aware of material getting to. And so I don't have an answer to that. Maybe there's someone else. Is there someone in this chat or in this group who actually knows that? I'd be welcome to that. Okay, maybe not, but I can certainly look into it. Thank you, Adam.
In the meantime, I can read out Natalie's question to you, Hannah.
Okay.
Thank you. Unless you would like to ask it as well, in which case just cut me off, but I can start. Thank you, Hannah, for a fabulous and expansive close reading. I'm wondering if you could share more thoughts about the relationship between text and graphics in general here, since so much focus has been given to event scores in their textual form only. Can the same construct of constative versus performative utterances apply to more iconic imagery? I also wanted to note how your remarks point brilliantly to how we may need to begin to track how event scores appear graphically over time as a mode of performance in and of itself. You are opening up even further the question of what counts as a performance in Fluxus.
That's a very generous question. Natalie, thank you. I absolutely think the graphic material can be explored using this understanding of roles, the various positions in speech act theory, absolutely. And I would say there's so much interest in the graphic nature of Fluxus design. I mean, one thing I want to say that is again a sort of critical reflection on my own work is I think I hadn't really understood in Fluxus. I'm thinking about Fluxus Experience a lot because all of a sudden it's coming out in these other languages, and I'm thinking, oh my, strange. But I hadn't really understood the close proximity between Maciunas's diagrams as learning machines and the way that his graphic work operates. That was for me a real a kind of aha moment in preparing for this talk. And I agree that it sort of opens up the way we might think about so many of these events. I used to give a lecture in one of my classes on straight lines in art. And I had many different versions of the Lamont Young, but also work by many, many different artists. It occurs to me that the same could be done with the graphic expressions of Fluxus events. And I could have done more. I mean, for me, especially that the wheel of feet, the boots that look like a gear, that for me is a completely strange image that, you know, a deeper analysis might look at, oh, thank you, Hannah. I see what you're doing. That's great. Might connect to the kind of weird stiffness of Maciunas, kind of something about how he was in his own body, this sort of some of the stiffness of some of the body pieces. You know, there are these other pieces, walking pieces in Fluxus that are a little bit more mechanistic about the body. The body isn't always this kind of fluid thing. I'm thinking about things like the Adriano Olivetti performance by Maciunas, with the kind of raised hats and, you know, actually any different gesture, but they're actions that occur based on a metronome, right? So the body is subject to the machine. And so when those feet moving in a circle become like a gear, I see a kind of subjugation, in a sense, maybe that's not even the right word, of the body to a machine logic that I think was super interesting to Maciunas as his critique of contemporary life, for sure. So yeah, there's a lot there in that question. Natalie, I want to think it through, but there's certainly a lot there. Thank you.
I will jump in if I may. Hannah, I was fascinated, you know, since the very beginning. You're talking also about time in other contexts, but also in precisely in this lecture when you speak about Kosugi's score, you know, My Feet, and you are talking about time as something, you know, through the rhythm, through the repetition, and you know, and there is obviously the mechanic time implied somewhere there as well. But I also wonder, you know, you came back to it while you were discussing the new reprint or the new publication of CCV3 that I just hold in my hands. I was also, you know, wondering whether there is a different notion of time there that is implied, you know, in the aging of materials when you encounter those newspapers, this kind of, you know, say early Fluxus materiality. It talks a very different story of time than the new reference. You know, obviously there is so much newness to it, and there is a different format, right? There are all those issues that you so rightly pointed out to, that we have all these issues in one hand, and there is no time intervals, no expectations, and so on and so forth. Yes, but there is also this kind of materiality of those newspapers, you know, the aging yellowish paper that one engages with when one searches through the archives, that is not more given perhaps here. And I wonder whether you could chat about this.
I think that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of, I think, nostalgia accruing to those kits, to the yellow newspaper. I mean, if anyone has tried to perform Alison's newspaper music recently, the instruction is to sort of read from newspapers from all over the world. And you used to be able to go to an international newsstand and buy newspapers from all over the world in any major city. And now to read that piece, I'm actually aware of an effort to perform it in New York in a few months. They're actually, you know, having people buy newspapers and bring them from all over the world. Sort of, if you're traveling, bring them here. And it speaks to a kind of decentralization of knowledge. And I think in some ways, there is something that we have lost and for which we may feel a little nostalgia looking back. And I'm including myself in that. I've got to turn my phone off because my texts are starting to come through, and I apologize for that. Yeah, I think that absolutely the kind of brittle old pieces of paper, or the way that, you know, the weird widgets in the kits are kind of like now cracked plastic. They speak to a time for which there is, at least in the art world, a great deal of nostalgia. Right, the kind of halcyon days of the 60s. So, you know, that's interesting to me. I won't forget easily my husband's mother, after seeing a Fluxus exhibit, made her own flux kit. She made a flux kit of all her travel documents, and, you know, little things. She had buttons and tickets from a trip she'd taken, and it was both very much in the spirit of, I think, what could be done with those kits, or with the idea of those kits, but also you know, far afield of how those original kits operate. I mean, you know, I'm not saying anything that you don't know well, Hannah, when I say, you know, the vitrinization of Fluxus makes me kind of crazy. The inability to interact with those things, because that actually produces the inaccessibility that reinforces the nostalgic emotion. So that's why I'm such a fan of the new version, you know, whether it's an imperfect facsimile of a newspaper, the impossibility of a full facsimile is super interesting, like where facsimiles fail. I was on a panel with James Hoff at Primary Information about a month and a half ago. That's where I got the idea for talking about the CCV tree this way. And he was saying how impossible it had been to do a perfect facsimile of the Great Bear pamphlets, because you could no longer find that kind of paper in those colors. And that's very much along the lines of these efforts to do the newspaper music. So yeah, I think the impossibility of the facsimiles connects us to, in a way, the revolutionary character of Maciunas's idea that these publications should go on forever. Mm-hmm. You know, that's Maciunas's idea. So preservation in this case, to my mind, I mean, obviously, look, nothing makes me happier than the Silverman collection landing at MoMA, because I know that those objects will be protected and watched over. But they also aren't really Fluxus in that context, at least not in the way that I find the most engaging, which is this world where I might hand Lamont Young's instruction to, I'm so lucky to be a teacher, to a student. Mm-hmm. And if they are serious, if they're earnest in it, they will get something out of it, you know? And that's something new, maybe something I never thought of. So yeah, that it's interesting. The yellowing newspaper is such an important phenomenon. I'm lucky enough to have quite a lot of yellowing newspaper that I, you know, got when my father died. But I'm fully aware that most people don't have access to that, to those originals. And I really value that. One of the stranger issues of Fluxus conservation that I've come upon, and which I see a lot in performance, is people who sort of dress the Fluxus part and then kind of copy a version of something that they saw in a photograph. And that, again, people can do what they want, but it seems to me that that's missing some of the inventiveness that is really a critical piece of the most radical art potential of the events.
Mm-hmm.
Bowler hats make me crazy. I mean, I can't stand it. But
It's,
that's another story.
It's fantastic. Yes, I really loved your response. I think also, perhaps there is a way of preserving these things in accepting their changeability, and the idea that when I evoke this idea of, yellow newspaper, I'm not necessarily thinking of preserving it by all means. I'm actually thinking whether the preservation here operates via, destruction, disintegration, and the wonderful other ways of performing Fluxus, as this kind of fragile materiality.
Yeah, you won't be surprised to learn that I bring real kits to my classes.
Nice.
And let students handle them. And, some pieces have disappeared or they've gotten jumbled, and I'm okay with that. But I'm extremely fortunate to be able to do that. Not most people can't do that, but yeah, lucky me, lucky students, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are so many other questions here. I want to acknowledge also Ken is commenting. A quick note on this. Can you let me know what I'm referring to? You can see the names of everyone. George, officially correspondent within the Fluxus membership and friendship list. He published regularly. Yes. And then he also says, Ken also says, as a follow-up to our other conversation, over the past 2 decades, many newspapers have simply disappeared. Newspapers printed on newsprint are uncommon, except for a few major newspapers in each national market. And UbuWeb publishes a nice digital version of the great pamphlets that can be downloaded freely. And I think as a comment, would you like to respond, or I will just perhaps take the next question just because of the time? And
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Aga Viloha is saying, thank you, Hannah, for this wonderful lecture. I wonder how the CC V3 can be employed as a learning machine for today's unprepared reader. Do you have any thoughts on how all of its richness can be conveyed to the broader public?
I mean, in writing this, I assumed that this was a moderately well-prepared audience. In other words, I could assume that everyone in this room had some working knowledge of what Fluxus is, or maybe what some of the critical debates are in it. I, kept referring to George Maciunas' Fluxus, or, those questions maybe wouldn't be such a good preparation. I think maybe if I were teaching this, what might I do? I might maybe reading Natalie's work on scores could be a place to start, because she complicates kind of what the score is and how that sort of moves across different media. And if you began with scores and then found yourself in the realm of the page, that might open it up. Yeah, I'm not sure. That's an interesting question and one I need to think about. Maybe you have some ideas. Does someone else have an idea? Because I would love to do this with students. I think it would be really fun.
Aga, would you like to jump in, or anyone?
Yeah, okay, I can actually. No, that's great, because when you were showing this this slide with kind of the directions of reading and how different parts of this design are referring to each other, and how Maciunas was actually playing with this chance as well, I just thought it was some kind of, like, I don't know, digital tools to do that, to explain this. But I mean, that's maybe too much, but somehow, like within this today's what today's technology is affording, and how today public is engaging with this kind of content is so different, right? Through screens and scrolling and this kind of stuff. So I was just inspired somehow by the way you have been explaining that, and where it can be taken further. So thank you so much for that.
So what that makes me think, your name is Aga. Hi, Aga. What that makes me, can I use your first name? That makes me think, perverse as it may be, maybe if someone had, in connection to, say, my scans, sort of ways to kind of click and learn a little bit, sort of build the tethers for themselves around the different events, and then kind of be able to go back to reading. And maybe that would be a way to, I mean, it seems it's perverse in a sense, but maybe not so perverse, to kind of develop a sort of hybrid teaching space, between a physical printout or the VTRE facsimile and some sort of website that could be, in a non-linear way, connect to various ideas, right? The idea of a worldwide protest would certainly, by today's standards, be something that students would be, incredibly interested in. So as someone in the Midwest, we have a lot of protests happening right now. So yeah, it's a very rich time. Yeah.
Curious for the not unrelated, Natalie, again, do you, Hannah, or anyone else know in what fields, disciplines, the idea of versioning comes from? Is that something that has entered the lexicon of art conservation? The ideas associated with that term seem really helpful here. Yeah, I could comment on it later. Please feel free, Hannah.
Maybe, I don't know. I just started using the term because it felt like a useful word. But it could be that someone has taken it up and is doing something with it. Maybe a Google search or an academia search would find that out. But I like the idea too. My dissertation had it in the title. So it's an idea I've used kind of forever without actually thinking about whether other people were using it.
Ken is commenting, I may be wrong, but I think that this term and versioning, he corrects himself, yes, was created in the field of economics and information science by Hall Varian. I will check later and follow up. Use photocopies of CCV3. Okay, this is on another, but yes, absolutely. And in conservation, this ideas of versions, variations, or variability has been used and introduced many years ago and hotly discussed. I think it's a very productive, actually, way to think about how works or publication exists in the world. And I also wonder, because you I mentioned that your books, especially the Fluxus Experience book, has been translated and is now about to appear in Spanish. I wonder, it is also a way of versioning, right? The Fluxus Experience. Do you have agency over how this is being published, especially, if I'm not implying that you obviously perhaps speak Spanish, but not Korean, I assume. I would be it's such a difficult language for everyone who's not coming from there. But yes, do you have any agency over how those versionings happen as translation?
So one thing I want to say is I must have known that history of the word, because it's in the title of my dissertation. So that tells me that 28 years ago or 25 years ago, I must have found it and used it and then forgotten the source. So if I did that, I apologized. But I agree that it's very useful. And the second question, what was the second question?
Whether the translation, whether this is also a way of
So I have the right to, I mean, I have asked that that I have the capacity to have someone who does speak Spanish and then does speak Chinese review the translations to be sure that they're good. I'm especially concerned because sometimes Chinese translations apparently can be very wide of the original. So that is something I will attend to, but I elected not to change my text in any way. In other words, it's important to me that I got the ideas to where I could when that book was published. And I'm not particularly interested in, for example, like a revised introduction that kind of covers my backside. I think it's really important that the document be, in a sense, like a facsimile of the argument from its time and unchanged. But they did, it's so funny because here, I'll show you here's the Korean version. And it's so funny because, first of all, that's Dick on the cover in the 1962 Wiesbaden. But also, I think it's so interesting that they have the book cover and then these two steps that get you to the version of today. Like, it's somehow trying to represent, and maybe the designer wasn't aware of this, but it looks to me like a representation of the idea of the reprint as part of the cover of it, which is an attitude that I really, really love. Yeah.
And on this note, because we just ran out of time, actually over
really
time already,
but
but
so fun. It
went so
fast.
Fantastic, yes. And Hannah, I just wanted to, in the name of all of us, thank you really so much for your generosity in sharing knowledge, in sharing this wonderful lecture. For those of you who, so again, please join me in clapping our hands virtually and thanking Hannah for this wonderful contribution. For those of you who follow our project, we will be publishing, most of all the lecture has been recorded, will be made available online as well, but we'll be publishing a version, right, of this talk as a chapter in our upcoming Activating Fluxus, Expanding Conservation volume. So please stay tuned. I also want to use this few more seconds to thank all the audience and discussants for those wonderful questions. My colleagues also, big thanks for co-convening this event, and to our technical assistant, Krzysztof Jaworowski, who made sure that everything runs smoothly in the background. If you are interested in what we are doing, please check out our website. It's now being just shown on the slide, activatingfluxus.com, and stay tuned for any other events that will follow. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you, Hannah, again, and thanks, everyone.
All right, take care. Thank you. Please feel free to email me if you want to, if you have any questions. All right, bye-bye.